Inside the Occult, the true story of Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, by Henry Steele Olcott. Chapter 1. The First Meeting of the Founders. Since I propose to narrate the story of the birth and progress of the Theosophical Society, I must begin at the beginning, telling how its two founders met for the first time. It was a quite prosaic incident. I said, "Permit me, madame," and offered her a light for her cigarette. Our acquaintance began in smoke, but it stirred up a great and permanent fire. The circumstances that brought us together were peculiar, as I shall shortly explain. The facts have been, in part, published previously. One day, in the month of July 1874, I was sitting in my law office, thinking about a naughty case for which the City of New York Company had retained me, when it occurred to me that, for years, I had paid no attention to the spiritualist movement. I do not know what association of ideas led my mind to pass from the mechanical construction of hydrometers to modern spiritualism, but, nonetheless, I went to a corner newsstand and bought a copy of the Banner of Light. In it, I read an account of certain incredible phenomena, namely, the solidification of phantom forms, which were said to be occurring at a farmhouse in the small locality of Chittenden, in the state of Vermont, several hundred miles from New York. I saw immediately that, if it were true that visitors could see, and even touch and converse with deceased relatives who found a means to reconstruct their bodies and clothing so as to become temporarily solid, visible, and tangible, this would be the most important fact of modern physical science. I determined to go and see for myself. I did so, found the story to be true, stayed for 3 or 4 days, and then returned to New York. I wrote an account of my observations for the New York Sun, an account which was published nearly all over the world, so great was the gravity and interest of the facts. A proposal was then made to me by the editor of the New York Daily Graphic that I return to Chittenden in the service of the paper, accompanied by an artist who would sketch under my orders, to make a rigorous investigation of the case. The subject interested me so deeply that I made the necessary disposition of my office engagements, and on September 17th, I was back at the Eddy homestead, as it was called after the name of the family that owned and occupied it. I stayed in that house of mystery, surrounded by phantoms, and having daily experiences of the most extraordinary nature, for about 12 weeks, if memory serves me. Meanwhile, twice a week there appeared in the Daily Graphic my letters about the Eddy ghosts, each illustrated with sketches of specters actually seen by the artist, Mr. Kappas, and by myself, as well as by every one of the persons, sometimes up to 40, present in the séance room. It was the publication of these letters that brought Madame Blavatsky to Chittenden, and thus brought us together. I remember our first day's acquaintance as if it were yesterday. Furthermore, I recorded the main facts in my book, People from the Other World. It was a sunny day, and even the gloomy old farmhouse looked cheerful. It sits amidst a lovely landscape, in a valley bounded by grassy slopes that rise into mountains covered to their very summits by leafy groves. It was the time of Indian summer, when the whole country is covered with a faint bluish mist, similar to that which gave the Nilgiri Mountains their name, and the foliage of the beeches, elms, and maples, touched by early frosts, turns from green to a blend of gold and crimson that lends the landscape the appearance of royal tapestries hung everywhere. One must go to America to see this autumnal splendor in the fullness of its perfection. Lunch at the Eddy homestead was at noon, and it was from the entrance door of the bare and comfortless dining room that Kappas and I first saw Helena Blavatsky. She had arrived shortly before noon with a French-Canadian lady, and when we entered, they were both at the table. My eye was first attracted by a scarlet Garibaldi shirt that the former was wearing, forming a vivid contrast with the dull colors around. Her hair was then a thick blonde mop, which she wore cut above her shoulders, and it stood out from her head, soft as silk and crinkled to the roots, like the fleece of a Cotswold sheep. This, and the red shirt, was what caught my attention before I observed the contour of her features. It was a massive Kalmuck face, contrasting in its suggestion of power, culture, and imperiousness with the commonplace faces in the room, as strangely as her red garment opposed the gray and white tones of the walls and woodwork and the dull costumes of the rest of the guests. All sorts of cranks were continually coming and going from the Eddy homestead to see the mediumistic phenomena, and it only occurred to me, upon seeing this eccentric lady, that she was just another of the genre. Pausing at the threshold, I whispered to Capys, "Good God, just look at that specimen." I crossed the room and took a seat opposite her, to indulge in my favorite habit, the study of personalities. The two ladies were conversing in French, making unimportant remarks, but I perceived immediately, by her accent and the fluency of her language, that if she were not Parisian, she must at least be a consummate French scholar. Dinner over, the two went outside the house and Madame Blavatsky rolled a cigarette, for which I offered a light as a pretext to enter into conversation. My remark having been made in French, we immediately passed to conversing in that language. She asked me how long I had been there and what I thought of the phenomena. She said that she herself felt great interest in such things, and that she had been drawn to Chittenden by reading the letters in the Daily Graphic. Public interest in these letters was growing to such an extent that it sometimes became impossible to find a copy of the paper at the newsstands an hour after publication, and she had paid $1 for a copy of the last number. I hesitated before coming here, she told me, because I was afraid of meeting this Colonel Olcott. "Why should you be afraid of him, madam?" I replied. "Oh, because I feared he might write about me in his paper." I told her that she could rest perfectly easy as to that, for I was fully certain that Colonel Olcott would not mention her in his correspondence unless she desired it. And I introduced myself. We became friends immediately. Each of us had the sensation of belonging to the same social universe as the other, cosmopolitans, freethinkers, and in closer communication with one another than with the rest of the people present, no matter how intelligent and respectable some of them might be. It was the voice of common solidarity for the occult and higher side of man and nature, the attraction of soul to soul, not of sex to sex. Neither at that time, in the beginning, nor on any subsequent occasion, did either of us have the sense that the other belonged to the opposite sex. We were simply comrades. So we regarded each other, so we called each other. From time to time, some vulgar people have dared to suggest that a more intimate bond united us, just as they have dared to suggest that that poor, grotesque, and persecuted Helena Blavatsky had been the mistress of various other men. But no pure person could hold such an opinion after spending some time in her company and seeing how her every look, word, and action proclaimed her asexuality. Strolling in the company of my new friend, we talked about the phenomena at the Eddy homestead and those of other lands. I discovered that she had been a great traveler and had seen many things of the occult and adepts of occult science, but at first she made no mention whatsoever regarding the existence of the Himalayan sages or her own powers. She spoke of the materialistic tendency of American spiritualism, which was a sort of debauch of phenomena, followed by a comparative indifference to philosophy. She had a graceful and captivating manner. Her criticisms of men and things were original and full of verve. She took a particular interest in dissuading me from my own ideas regarding spiritual matters, and showed herself pleased to discover that I, instinctively, had inclined toward the occult lines that she herself had embraced. It was not as an Oriental mystic, but rather as a refined spiritualist that she spoke. For my part, I knew nothing then, or almost nothing, about Oriental philosophy, and at first she remained silent on that subject. The séances of William Eddy, the chief medium of the family, took place every night in a large hall on the upper floor, in a wing of the house, above the dining room and the kitchen. He and a brother, Horatio, were hard-working farmers. Horatio occupied himself with outdoor duties, and William, since visitors had begun to flock from all parts of the United States, cooked for the family. They were poor, ill-educated, and prejudiced, sometimes rude toward their uninvited guests. At the very end of the séance room, the deep chimney coming from the kitchen passed through the roof. Between it and the north-facing wall, there was a small, narrow cabinet of a width equal to the depth of the chimney, 2 feet and 7 inches, in which William Eddy would sit waiting for the phenomena. He had no apparent control over these. He merely sat and waited for them to eventually happen. As there was a blanket hung at the doorway, the little room would remain in perfect darkness. Shortly after William entered the cabinet, the blanket was pulled aside and there advanced toward the audience some figure of a dead person, man, woman, or child. An animated statue, so to speak, temporarily rendered solid and substantial, but in the very next minute restored to nothingness or invisibility. Occasionally, these figures might dissipate while still fully visible to the spectators. Up to the time Helena Blavatsky made her appearance on the scene, the figures that had shown themselves were either Red Indians or Americans or Europeans related to the visitors. But on the first night of her stay at the homestead, specters of other nationalities came to us. There was a Georgian servant from the Caucasus, a Muslim merchant from Tiflis, a young Russian peasant girl, and others. On another night, there appeared a Kurdish horseman, armed with scimitar, pistols, and lance. A black sorcerer from Africa, tremendously ugly and of diabolical appearance, who wore a coronet of 4 oryx horns with little bells at the tips, attached to an embroidered fillet, profusely colored, tied around his head, and a European gentleman, wearing the cross and collar of Saint and recognized by Madame Blavatsky as her uncle. The advent of such figures in the séance room of those poor and almost illiterate Vermont farmers, who had no money to acquire theatrical apparatus, nor experience to employ such things if they had them, nor space where they could utilize them, was, to any eyewitness, a convincing proof that the apparitions were genuine. They showed, at the same time, that Madame Blavatsky was possessed of a strange attraction in evoking these images from that which the Asians term kamaloka. It was only much later that I learned she had evoked them by her own developed and masterful power. She even affirms the fact in a note written in our scrapbook, Volume 1, attached to a clipping from the Spiritualist of London of January 1875. During her stay in Chittenden, she told me many incidents of her past life, among others of having been present as a volunteer with several other European ladies and with Garibaldi at the bloody Battle of Mentana. As proof of her story, she showed me the place where her left arm had been broken in 2 places, resulting from a saber blow, and made me feel in her right shoulder a musket ball still embedded in the muscle and yet another in her leg. She also showed me a scar just below the heart, where a stiletto had penetrated. This wound reopened a little while she was at Chittenden, and it was to consult me regarding it that she showed it to me. She told me many curious cases of dangers and adventures, among these the story of the ghost of the African sorcerer with the coronet of oryx horns, whom, when alive, she had seen produce phenomena in Upper Egypt many years before. Helena Blavatsky did what she could to lead me to suspect the phenomena of William Eddy as proofs of the intelligent control of a medium by spirits. She told me that, in case they were genuine, they must be the medium's double, which exits his body and clothes itself in other appearances, but I did not believe her. I argued that the forms presented an extreme diversity of height, bulk, and appearance to be a disguise of William Eddy. They must indeed be what they seem to be, that is, spirits of the dead. Our disputes were quite heated on certain occasions, for at that time I had not yet deepened my knowledge sufficiently on the question of the plastic nature of the human double, so as to perceive the force of her illusions, whereas of the Oriental theory of Maya, I knew absolutely nothing. However, as she told me, the result was that she became convinced of my disposition not to accept anything on trust and to cling tenaciously to such facts, as I did or thought I was doing. We became greater friends day by day, and by the time she was preparing to leave Chittenden, she had accepted from me the nickname Jack, and thus she signed herself in the letters she sent me from New York. When we parted, it was as good friends, so as to continue the relationship that had begun so pleasantly. In November 1874, upon finishing my researches, I returned to New York and went to visit her at her address at 16 Irving Place, where she performed for me some seances of table-turning and rapping, receiving messages of all kinds, mainly from an invisible intelligence that called itself John King. This pseudonym has become familiar, in these last 40 years, to frequenters of seances throughout the world. One heard of him for the first time in 1850, at the Spiritualist Center of Jonathan Coombs of Ohio, where the one who so called himself claimed to be the chief of a tribe or tribes of spirits. Subsequently, he claimed to be the earthbound soul of Sir Henry Morgan, the famous pirate, and it was as such that he presented himself to me. He showed me his face and head wrapped in a turban in Philadelphia in the course of my investigations into the Holmes mediums, conducted in conjunction with the late and respected Robert Dale Owen, General F.J. Lippett, and Madame Blavatsky. I spoke with both and they wrote to me, the latter more assiduously. John King had beautiful handwriting and used extravagant expressions of Old English. I judged him then a true John King, for his personality, I imagined, had been proved to me as convincingly as one could desire. Now, however, after seeing what Helena Blavatsky was capable of doing in the way of producing Mayavic, that is, hypnotic illusions, and in the control of elementals, I am persuaded that John King was a deceptive elemental which she managed like a puppet and utilized as a resource for my education. Understand this. The phenomena were real, but they were not produced by any disembodied human spirit. Upon writing what I have set forth above, I discovered the proof of these statements in her own manuscripts, pasted in our scrapbook, Volume 1. She kept up the illusion for months, I cannot exactly say how many after all this time, and I witnessed numbers of phenomena supposedly produced by John King, as, for instance, the whole remarkable series at the Holmes's residence in Philadelphia, and those of Helena Blavatsky herself, to which I have just referred. He was initially John King, an independent personality, then John King, messenger and servant, never the equal of her living adepts, and finally a pure and simple elemental employed by Helena Blavatsky and another certain specialist in the production of wonders. It is unnecessary to deny that, throughout the first phase of her residence in the United States, Madame Blavatsky called herself a spiritualist and vigorously defended spiritualism and its mediums from the attacks of wiseacres and other acerbic detractors. Her letters, published in various American and English journals, contain much evidence of this stance she adopted. Among other examples, I will simply quote the following. I have done, so to speak, only my duty, First, regarding spiritualism, which I defended as best I could from the attacks and impostures perpetrated under the too transparent mask of science. Next, regarding the two mediums, helpless and outraged. But I am obliged to confess that, in truth, I do not believe I have done any good to spiritualism itself. It deeply saddens my heart to acknowledge this fact, for I begin to think there is no remedy for it. For more than 15 years, I have fought my battle for the blessed truth, traveled and preached it, though I was not born a lecturer, from the snowy peaks of the Caucasus Mountains, as well as from the sandy valleys of the Nile. I have proved its truth through practice and persuasion. For the sake of spiritualism, I left my home, a pleasant life in the bosom of civilized society, and became a wanderer on the face of the earth. I had already seen my hopes realized, beyond my most ardent expectations, when my ill-fated star brought me to America. Knowing that this country is the cradle of modern spiritualism, I came here from France imbued with feelings similar to those of a Mohammedan approaching the birthplace of the Prophet, etc., etc. Letter from Helena Blavatsky to the journal The Spiritualist of London, dated December 13, 1874. The two helpless mediums to whom she alluded were the Holmeses, of whose moral stature I have always held the least flattering of opinions. Still in the presence of Helena Blavatsky, I witnessed, under my own experimental conditions, together with the late Robert Dale Owen and General Lippitt, a series of the most convincing and satisfactory mediumistic phenomena. Later, I became somewhat suspicious that the power producing such phenomena came from Helena Blavatsky, and that if only the Holmeses, they alone, had been involved, I would have witnessed only tricks or nothing at all. Now, scanning old scrapbooks, I discover in a memorandum by Helena Blavatsky, which I proceed to transcribe, and which she evidently intended to be published after her death. Important note. Yes, I am constrained to say that I had to identify myself during that shameful exposure of the Holmes mediums with spiritualism. I had to save the situation, for I was sent from Paris to America with the purpose of proving the phenomena and their reality, and to demonstrate the fallacy of the spiritualist theory regarding spirits. But how could I do it better? I did not want people to know indiscriminately that I could produce the same things at will. I was ordered otherwise, and I still had to keep alive the reality, the genuineness, and the possibility of such phenomena in the hearts of those who, from materialists, had become spiritualists, but now, due to the exposure of various mediums, had begun to recede, returning to their skepticism. That is why, selecting a little of what is credible, I went to the Holmeses and, aided by Mahatma Maurya and his power, I brought from the astral light the faces of John King and Katie King, produced the materialization phenomena, and allowed the spiritualists at large to believe that this was done through the mediumship of Mrs. Holmes. She herself was terribly frightened, for she knew that, this time, the apparition was real. Did I do wrong? The world is not yet prepared to understand the philosophy of occult science. Let them first assure themselves that there are beings in an invisible world, be they spirits of the dead or elementals, and that there are in man hidden powers capable of making him a god on earth. When I am dead, people may perhaps come to appreciate my disinterested motives. I pledged my word to help people on the path of truth while I lived, and I will keep my word. Let them offend and slander me. Let some call me a medium and a spiritualist, and others an impostor. The day will come when posterity will learn to know me better. Oh, poor foolish, credulous, and mischievous world! The whole thing becomes quite clear here. The spiritualism she was sent to profess in America, and which came eventually to replace the cruder Western mediumship, was Eastern spiritualism or Brahma Vidya. The West not being prepared to accept it, the first work assigned to her was the defense of the real phenomena of the circle from that militant and prejudiced enemy of spiritual belief. Physical science, semi-learned and materialist, with its leaders and sectaries. What was truly necessary for the time was to attack materialist skepticism and strengthen the spiritual basis of religious yearning. Thus, then, the battle engaged. She aligned herself with the American spiritualists, and made, at that moment, common cause with them. Yes, posterity shall do her justice. I would like to be able to recall the first phenomenon she confessedly produced as an exercise of the power of her own will, but I cannot. It must have been soon after she began to write Isis Unveiled, and it was possibly the following. After moving from number 16, Irving Place, and paying a visit to friends in the country, she occupied for some time rooms in another house on Irving Place, a few doors beyond the Lotus Club on the same side of the street. It was there that, later, an informal group of friends gathered, in which I proposed the formation of what would subsequently become the Theosophical Society. Among Madame Blavatsky's guests was an Italian artist, a certain Signor B., an ex-Carbonaro. I was sitting alone with her in the drawing room when this gentleman paid his first visit. He and the hostess conversed about Italian affairs, and he suddenly pronounced the name of one of the greatest adepts. She started as if she had received an electric shock, looked straight into the visitor's eyes, and said, in Italian, "What is it? I am ready." He casually changed the subject, but from then on the conversation was all about magic, magicians, and adepts. Signor B. went and opened one of the French windows, made some mimic passes towards the outside air, and immediately a pure white butterfly entered the room and flew almost to the ceiling. Helena Blavatsky laughed jovially and said, "That is beautiful, but I can do it too." She, likewise, opened the window, made similar mimic passes, and without delay, a second white butterfly entered, fluttering. It rose to the ceiling, followed the other around the room, played with it for moments, flew with it to a corner, and, presto! Suddenly both disappeared while we were looking at them. "What does this mean?" I asked. "Only this, that Signor B. can make an elemental transform into a butterfly just as I can. The insects were not real but illusory. I remember other examples of the control she had over elementals, or, as the Hindus would say, Yakshini Vidya. A remote instance is the following. On a cold winter night, when several inches of snow had accumulated on the ground, she and I were working on her book until late in her rooms on 34th Street. At dinner, I had eaten some rather salty food, and around 1 in the morning, feeling very thirsty, I said to her, "Wouldn't it be nice to have some hothouse grapes?" "Certainly would," she replied. "Let us get some." "But the shops have been closed for hours, and we cannot buy anything," I said. "No matter, we shall have the grapes anyway," was her answer. "But how?" "I will show you, if you will do the kindness of turning down the light of that lamp on the table in front of us." I automatically turned the cock until I almost extinguished the light. "You did not need to have done that," she said. "I only wanted you to dim the light a little. In any case, turn it up again quickly." Within easy reach of my hand was a box of matches, and, in an instant, I relit the lamp. "Look," she exclaimed, pointing to a bookshelf on the wall in front of us. To my amazement, hanging from the edges at both ends of one of the shelves were 2 large bunches of ripe black Hamburg grapes, which we proceeded to eat. To my question regarding the means employed, She said the thing had been done by certain elementals under her control, and twice later, when we were living in the so-called lamasery. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.